Thrown out before winter, she built a bark teepee for $0. Gunnar Halvorsen, who had survived 11 Minnesota winters, told her, "You'll watch those girls turn blue. There won't be a thing you can do but hold them while they die." She had $9, 2 daughters, and needed 8 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 55 degrees in 7 hours. But 5 months earlier, Karin Lindqvist had never built anything larger than a butter churn. The wagon crested a low rise in mid-August of 1887, and Karin pulled the horse to a stop. Below her lay 160 acres of Minnesota forest and meadow. Her husband Eric had filed on this land the previous spring. He had described it in his letters: the creek that ran clear along the southern boundary, the stand of birch and pine that would provide timber, the meadow that would become fields. He had started a cabin before the typhoid took him. He had promised to finish it by fall. Karin climbed down from the wagon seat. Her daughters, Britta, 6, and Maya, 4, stayed where they were, watching their mother walk toward the half-built structure that was supposed to be their home. 4 courses of logs. That was all. 4 courses high, roughly 12 by 14 feet. No roof, no floor, no chinking between the logs. Eric had gotten this far before returning to St. Paul for supplies. He never came back. Karin walked the perimeter. She pressed her hand against the topmost log. The bark was still on it, rough under her palm. She looked up at the sky where a roof should have been. A crow called from somewhere in the tree line. Behind her, Maya started to cry. The sound carried across the empty meadow, and there was no one to hear it except Karin and the crows and whatever else lived in these woods. She had $9, a wagon, 1 draft horse that was too old for heavy work, an axe, a hatchet, a bucksaw, a spade, the clothes on her back and the children's backs, 2 months of flour if she stretched it, the title to this land that would become hers if she could prove up the claim, 5 years of residence, a habitable dwelling, cultivation of the soil. 5 years. She had to survive 5 winters in a place where her husband had died before finishing 4 walls. The first frost would come in October, 8 weeks away. Gunnar Halvorsen arrived 3 days later. Karin heard the horse before she saw him, the heavy plod of an animal used to work, not speed. She was behind the cabin walls, trying to figure out how logs this heavy had been lifted into place by one man. The answer, she had realized, was that they hadn't been. Eric must have had help. Help she didn't have. Halvorsen rode around the cabin and stopped. He was an older man, late 50s, with a face weathered to leather by Minnesota winters. His left hand was missing 2 fingers. He didn't introduce himself. He just looked at the roofless walls, the empty space where a woodpile should be. The woman standing alone with an axe she clearly didn't know how to swing. "You're the Lindqvist widow," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." He dismounted and walked the perimeter the way Karin had, but his eyes read something different. He saw not what was there, but what was missing. No roof, no chinking, no floor, no stove. "You've got that camp stove, I see, the sheet iron one. Leaks heat like a sieve." He stopped at the corner where 2 logs didn't quite meet. "No firewood, not a single cord." "I know what I don't have." "Do you know what you need?" He turned to face her. 8 cords minimum, maybe 10 with that stove. You'll burn through a cord in 4 days once it drops below 0, and it will drop below 0. It will drop to 20 below, 30 below, 40 below. I've seen it go to 50 below. I've seen men freeze standing up, caught between the barn and the house. 60 feet couldn't find their way. He pointed at the cabin walls. That's 3 weeks' work for a man with experience. Roof, chinking, floor. You haven't got 3 weeks. And you can't cut timber and watch children at the same time. Karen said nothing. Where are the girls? By the creek, washing. Halverson shook his head. Creek's got holes. Water moves fast after the rains. One falls in, gets lost in the woods, wanders onto thin ice come December. He stopped. You'll be burying them alone, if you can find them. I won't let them out of my sight. Then you won't cut timber. You can't do both. He walked back to his horse. I lost 2 fingers in the blizzard of '80. Watched a man freeze in a sod dugout that winter. Good man, experienced, just ran out of wood at the wrong time. I've buried 3 people in 11 years on this land. 2 from cold. 1 from a falling tree cutting firewood alone. He mounted up. A bark tent won't hold heat past November. You'll watch those girls turn blue, and there won't be a thing you can do but hold them while they die. Karin felt her hands clench. Sell the claim, Halverson said. Take what you can get. Go back to wherever you came from before the ground freezes. He rode away without waiting for a response. He'd given his verdict. In his experience, verdicts like that didn't need acknowledgement. They came true on their own. Karen did the math that night by firelight. To finish the cabin, logs for a roof, which meant felling trees she couldn't fell, or purchasing lumber at $30 to $40 per 1,000 board feet, which she couldn't afford, shingles or sod for roofing, chinking material, mud and grass and moss pressed between every log, a proper stove at $15 to $25, or enough stone to build a fireplace, which meant hauling stone she couldn't haul, 8 to 10 cords of firewood, cut and split and stacked, food for 5 months, $60 to $80. That was the minimum. She had 9. The labor required, cabin completion plus firewood cutting, would take an experienced man working alone 8 to 10 weeks. She had 8 weeks until frost. She had no experience. She had 2 children who could not be left alone. She lay awake on the wagon bed, the girls pressed against her for warmth, and she understood why Halverson had told her to sell. The numbers didn't work. They couldn't be made to work. Every path she could see led to the same place. December, the cabin unfinished, the firewood gone, the temperature dropping, and nothing between her children and the cold. Britta stirred beside her. Mama, why aren't we sleeping in Papa's house? It isn't finished yet. Can you finish it? Karen looked up at the canvas over the wagon bed. Beyond it, stars she couldn't see. Beyond that, winter she couldn't stop. I don't know, she said. Go to sleep. The Ojibwe family was camped by the creek in early September. Karen saw them first as smoke, a thin column rising from trees she thought were empty. She should have been afraid. The newspapers in St. Paul were full of stories about Indians, none of them kind, but she'd been alone for 3 weeks, and the loneliness was starting to feel more dangerous than any stranger. She took the girls with her. They walked along the creek, following the smoke, until they came to a clearing where a structure stood that Karen had never seen before. It was conical, 14 feet across at the base, perhaps 11 feet tall, made of bark sheets layered over a framework of poles. Smoke rose from an opening at the top, clean and straight. The door was a flap of bark that had been pulled aside. Inside, Karen could see a small fire burning. A woman emerged. She was perhaps Karen's age, dressed in a mix of traditional and trade cloth clothing. 2 children followed her, a boy and a girl, close in age to Brita and Maya. The woman looked at Karen. Karen looked at the shelter. How long? Karen asked, pointing at the structure miming construction. How long to build? The woman studied her. Then she held up both hands, fingers spread. 7. She pointed at the pole frame, then 3 more fingers. She pointed at the bark covering. 10 days total. She mimed working alone. Karen walked closer. The interior was warm, warmer than the morning air outside, though the fire was barely larger than what Karin used to heat coffee. The bark sheets overlapped like shingles on a roof, each one sewn to the pole frame with some kind of fiber cordage. The seams were sealed with a dark substance that looked like pitch. How much wood? Karin pointed at the fire, mimed burning, pointed at a pile of sticks near the entrance. To stay warm? The woman looked at the pile. She held up her thumb and forefinger close together. A little? Very little. Karin stood in the warmth of that bark-covered shelter, and something shifted in her mind. The numbers that hadn't worked began to rearrange themselves. She couldn't finish the cabin, but she could gather bark. She couldn't cut 8 cords of firewood, but if the shelter needed less fuel, far less, then maybe she didn't have to. She couldn't build with logs she couldn't lift. But poles like these, thin and light, she could carry herself. The woman, Karin would learn her name was Nimi, watched the white woman's face as understanding arrived. There was a risk, a terrible risk. If Karin spent her preparation time building a bark shelter instead of working on the cabin, and the shelter failed, she would have nothing, no backup, no second chance. The half-finished cabin would be useless by December, but the cabin was already useless. There was no path from where she stood to a finished cabin by winter. She'd done the math. Halvorsen had done the math. Everyone who looked at her situation saw a woman who was going to die. Maybe there was a path they weren't seeing. The frame went up faster than Karin expected. 16 poles of tamarack, 13 to 15 feet long, thin enough at the base that she could carry 2 at a time. She cut them from a stand of young trees at the edge of the meadow, working while the girls played within sight. The axe was heavy. The work was slow, but the poles came down one by one, and she dragged them to the site she'd chosen, a level spot 50 yards from Eric's useless cabin, sheltered from the worst wind by a rise to the northwest. She dug holes for the pole bases with her spade, 8 inches deep. She set the first 3 poles as a tripod, lashing them at the top with strips of basswood bark she'd learned to soak and twist until they held like rope. Then the remaining poles, one by one, leaning against the tripod, lashed at every crossing point. By September 15th, the frame was complete. It looked fragile. It looked like something a strong wind would flatten. But when Karin pushed against it, the structure held. The forces distributed themselves through the lashing points, each pole supporting the others. She had built something. For the first time in her life, she had built something that stood on its own. Agnes Dahl arrived the next day. She was a widow, too, 2 years now, who had survived by remarrying a widower with a working farm. The conventional path. The path Halvorsen had probably meant when he told Karin to go back to wherever she came from. Agnes was 41, practical, and she had heard about the bark tent from someone who had heard about it from someone else. News traveled fast when there wasn't much of it. She walked around the pole frame, frowning. "Are you building a bark tent, like the Indians use?" "I am." "Karin, I know you're desperate." Agnes touched one of the poles, testing its strength. "But this isn't going to work. Those structures are for summer camps, for people who move when the seasons change. You're trying to winter in one place with 2 babies." "They're not babies. They're young enough." Agnes kept walking, her eyes moving from pole to pole. "The bark will crack in the cold. The seams will split. Snow will get in. I've seen it happen. My husband, my first husband, found a trapper once, dead in a bark shelter in February. Frozen solid. The bark had pulled apart at the seams." Karin had heard these arguments already, in her own head. She'd answered them there. Now she answered them out loud. The trapper didn't have a liner. An inner wall hung inside the frame, with a gap between it and the bark. The gap traps air. Dead air doesn't conduct cold the way moving air does, and the liner channels the smoke upward, keeps it from pooling. Agnes looked skeptical. How do you know this? I watched. I asked questions. I watched some more. Watched who? The Indians. Her name is Nemi. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she started a different argument. Have you thought about what the land office will say? A bark tepee isn't a dwelling, Karen. Not legally. The Homestead Act requires a habitable dwelling. When you try to prove up, they'll look at this. She gestured at the poles. And they'll reject your claim. 2 years of your husband's work, gone. 4 years of proving up, gone. You'll lose everything. This was a problem Karen hadn't considered. They require a dwelling, she said. They don't specify logs. They don't have to specify. Everyone knows what a dwelling is. It's a cabin. It's a sod house. It's 4 walls and a roof and a floor, with a door that locks and a stove that burns coal or wood. Agnes shook her head. You can survive in a bark tent, maybe, if you're lucky, but you can't build a life on it. You can't prove up a claim. You can't stay. Then I'll build a cabin later, after I survive this winter. With what money? With what help? You'll be weaker in spring than you are now, if you're alive at all. Karen looked at the frame she'd built. 16 poles, lashed and standing, the beginning of something. I can't finish the cabin, she said. You know the math. Everyone knows the math. If I try to finish it, I'll run out of time before the roof is on, and then I'll have nothing. At least this way I have a chance. Agnes sighed. I hope you're right. I'll pray for you. Don't pray. When spring comes, help me with the cabin. That's more useful than prayers. Agnes almost smiled. You have a harder head than your husband did. She left without agreeing, but she didn't argue anymore either. Lars Bergstrom came in late September, and he didn't come to pray. He owned the 320 acres that bordered Karin's claim to the north. A successful man by frontier standards, frame house, barn, 3 hired hands during planting and harvest. He had filed on Eric's land years ago before Eric arrived, but his claim had been rejected on a technicality. When Eric died, Bergstrom assumed the widow would fail. Widows usually did. Then he could buy the land cheap or wait for the claim to be abandoned and refile. A bark tent was not part of his calculations. He rode up while Karin was attaching bark sheets to the pole frame. The structure was 60% covered now, the sheets overlapping from bottom to top, sewn to the poles with cordage and sealed with pine pitch. It was starting to look like something. It was starting to look like someone planned to stay. Bergstrom didn't dismount. He sat on his horse and watched Karin work, and when she didn't stop to greet him, he spoke anyway. You're making a fool of yourself, Mrs. Lindqvist. The whole county is talking about the Swede widow living in an Indian tent. What do you think that does to property values around here? What do you think it says about the kind of people settling this land? Karen kept working. Stitch, pull, tighten. Stitch, pull, tighten. The rhythm steadied her hands. I'll give you $12 for the claim. That's more than fair for land with nothing on it but a pile of poles and some tree bark. Take the money. Go somewhere civilized. Raise those girls in a proper house. Karin reached for another strip of bark. Mrs. Lindqvist, I heard you. And no. Bergstrom's horse shifted. He steadied it with a jerk of the reins. You'll change your mind by December. They always do. Just don't wait until the ground is too frozen to dig graves. He turned and rode away. Karen watched him go. Then she went back to work. Stitch, pull, tighten, 1 sheet of bark at a time. October came with frost. Karen woke one morning to find ice on the water bucket, a skim of white that cracked when she touched it. The girl's breath made clouds when they spoke. The leaves on the birch trees had turned yellow, and some had already fallen, leaving branches bare against the gray sky. The bark structure was 75% covered. The interior liner, canvas pieced together from the wagon cover and worn clothing was half finished. She had cut 1.5 cords of firewood from deadfall, wood that had already fallen and dried, easier to cut than standing timber. Halverson's voice in her head. 8 cords minimum, maybe 10. She wasn't going to reach 8 cords, but maybe she didn't have to. The bark shelter had less than half the volume of a cabin. The fire sat in the center, radiating heat in all directions instead of being stuck at one end. The liner trapped air, insulating the living space from the cold bark walls. Maybe 4 cords would be enough, maybe 3. She cut wood until her arms shook and then cut more. Britta helped carry the smaller pieces. Maya gathered kindling. They worked together as a family, doing work no one thought they could do, building something no one thought would stand. The storm hit in mid-October. Wind came first, a roar out of the northwest that bent the pine trees and sent leaves flying like frightened birds. Karin was on the far side of the structure, sealing a seam with pine pitch, when the first gust nearly knocked her down. She ran to find the girls, pulled them inside, and lashed the door flap closed. Rain followed, then hail, chunks of ice the size of acorns that drummed against the bark walls and bounced off the conical roof. The structure shuddered with each gust. Karen sat with her arms around her daughters and waited to see if everything she'd built would blow away. It didn't. The wind hit the cone and slid over it, the way water slides over a rock in a stream. The bark sheets flexed, but held. The lashing points creaked, but didn't give. The structure swayed and settled and swayed again, absorbing the force instead of fighting it. But when the storm passed, Karin found damage. A section of bark on the northeast side had torn loose, a seam she hadn't sealed properly. Weakened by rain, ripped open by the wind. Water had gotten inside. The canvas liner material, still unhung, was soaked. 2 days of lost work. She spread the canvas by the fire to dry, patched the damaged seam with double-thick pitch, cut replacement bark sheets from a fallen birch. The first snow came while she was still repairing the damage, 2 inches that melted by noon but left no doubt about what was coming. 8 weeks had become 6. 6 weeks would become 4. Time was running out, and every setback pushed her closer to the edge. Naomi returned in late October. She came with her family, her husband, her 2 children, an older woman who might have been a grandmother. They were on their way to their winter camp farther north, but they stopped at Karen's claim, and Naomi walked around the bark shelter the way Halverson and Agnes and Bergstrom had, studying what the white woman had built. Karen watched her face for judgment. She saw something else instead. Interest. Respect. Concern. Naomi pointed at the smoke flaps, 2 triangular pieces of bark at the apex, controlled by exterior poles. Karen had copied them from what she'd seen at Naomi's camp, but she hadn't fully understood how they worked. The angle was wrong. Smoke was pooling at the top instead of venting cleanly. Without asking permission, Naomi climbed up and adjusted the poles. She showed Karin the correct angle for wind from the west, then how to change it for wind from the north. Smoke flap management, she seemed to be saying, was almost an art. It took practice. It took paying attention to the wind. Before she left, Naomi gave Karin 3 things. A bundle of prepared basswood cordage, better than anything Karin had made, a clay pot of rendered bear grease for sealing seams, and something she said in her own language that Karin didn't understand. Karin tried to pay with the last of her cornmeal. Naomi refused. She pointed at Britta and Maya, playing with her own children in the meadow. She spoke again, the same phrase, and gestured at them all. For them. For the children. That was how Karin interpreted it. They left the next morning, heading north. Karin watched them go. Then she turned back to the shelter and kept working. By the 5th of November, the structure was complete. 16 poles forming a cone 14 feet across and 11 feet tall. Birch bark sheets sewn to the frame in overlapping layers sealed with pine pitch and bear grease. A canvas liner hung 6 feet high on the interior, creating a dead air gap for insulation. 2 smoke flaps at the apex controlled by exterior poles. A door flap that could be lashed closed against the wind. Karen lit the first fire that evening. The smoke rose straight and clean through the adjusted flaps. The interior warmed quickly, far more quickly than she'd expected. She'd spent weeks in front of the sheet iron camp stove, feeding it constantly, never quite warm enough. This was different. The heat radiated from the center fire in all directions. It reflected off the liner and stayed close. Britta and Maya sat by the fire, eating soup made from dried beans and salt pork. Their faces were golden in the firelight. For the first time since they had arrived at the claim, they looked like children who might survive the winter. The structure had cost nothing. No cash anyway. It had cost labor and time and blisters that became calluses that cracked and bled. It had cost Karen 8 or 10 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. It had cost her standing in a community that already hadn't wanted her, but it was done. November had come, and she had shelter. She had 3 cords of firewood. Not the 8 to 10 Halverson had said a cabin required. But the shelter was smaller, and the fire was central, and the liner held the heat close. 3 cords might be enough. She would find out soon. She had enough food for 2 months, maybe a little more. Cornmeal and dried beans and salt pork, traded for sewing work she'd done for a passing trapper. If she rationed carefully, if the winter wasn't too long, if nothing else went wrong, but something always went wrong. And winter hadn't truly arrived yet. Halverson came in mid-November, curious despite himself. He found Cochran outside the shelter, splitting firewood. He walked around the structure the way he had walked around the cabin foundation back in August, reading what was there and what was missing. But this time, there was more to read. He ducked inside. Karen followed him, setting down the axe. The interior was warm, perhaps 55 degrees, though the temperature outside was in the 20s. A small fire burned in the center, far smaller than what his own fireplace required. Smoke rose cleanly through the apex. He stood there for a long moment, not speaking. "It's holding for now," he finally said. "But this isn't winter. This is autumn with snow. Wait until it drops to 30 below. Wait until the wind comes off the lake at 40 miles an hour for 3 days straight. Then we'll see." He looked at her. She looked back. "You might make it," he said. "I didn't think you would. I'm not sure I think so now, but you might." He ducked back through the door flap. "Keep that fire burning. Don't let it go out. And if a storm comes, a real storm, not like what we've had, don't try to go anywhere. Stay inside, tend the fire, and hope." He walked to his horse. "Halverson," Karen called. He turned. "What happened to the man you found frozen in the sod dugout?" His face changed, something passing behind his eyes like clouds across the sun. "He ran out of wood, burned everything he had, furniture, clothes, parts of the structure itself. Wasn't enough. When I found him, he was sitting upright with his arms around his children." He mounted his horse. "Don't let that happen to you." He rode away. Karen picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood. December came with cold that reached deeper than Karen had known cold could reach. -10 degrees. -15. -22. One morning when she checked the creek and found it frozen solid. The structure held. The fire burned. The interior stayed above 40 degrees most of the time, dropping into the high 30s on the worst nights, but never falling to the point where water froze inside. She burned a quarter cord per week. At this rate, Her 3 cords would last 12 weeks. Winter in northern Minnesota ran 20 weeks or more. She needed to find more wood. She found it in deadfall, branches torn down by the October storm, logs from trees that had died years ago. Frozen wood burned, though not as well as seasoned wood. She dragged what she could find back to the shelter, cut it into pieces, stacked it against the bark wall where she could reach it without going outside. The girls helped less now. The cold was too dangerous. Karen worked alone while they stayed inside, tending the fire, keeping each other company. She came back with ice in her hair and fingers she couldn't feel, and she sat by the fire until the feeling came back, and then she went out again. Survival wasn't a single test. It was 1,000 small tests, repeated every day, and you couldn't fail any of them. Late December brought a warm spell, temperatures rising to 30 degrees, snow melting on the bark walls. Everyone knew what this meant. The warm spells before January were the false gifts. They melted the snow, created meltwater that refroze into ice, and then the real cold came. Karen used the warmth to check every seam on the structure. She resealed anything that looked weak. She hauled extra wood. She made sure the smoke flaps moved freely. She did everything she could think of to prepare. January arrived mild. The first week passed without crisis. The second week brought more warmth, temperatures in the high 30s, almost spring-like for this time of year. People in town shed their heavy coats. Some opened windows for the first time since November. On the morning of January 12th, Karen woke to sunshine. The girls played outside for the first time in weeks, making snow figures in the slush, laughing at things Karen couldn't hear from where she stood hauling water from the creek. She thought, we might make it. She didn't see the wall of cloud building to the northwest. She didn't know that by noon the temperature would begin to fall. She didn't know that the winter of 1887 to 88 would end with the worst blizzard in 30 years, a storm that would drop the temperature 55 degrees in 7 hours and kill 235 people across the northern plains. She knew only that the sun was shining, and her daughters were laughing, and the bark shelter that everyone said would fail was still standing. The real test hadn't come yet, but it was coming. The cloud wall appeared just before noon. Karen was carrying water from the creek when she saw it, a line of darkness stretching across the northwestern horizon, moving toward her faster than anything weather-shaped should move. One moment the sky was blue. The next, half of it was gone, swallowed by something that looked less like a storm and more like the edge of the world. She dropped the water bucket and ran. Maya had been feverish that morning. Nothing serious, Karen had thought. A slight warmth to her forehead, a tiredness in her eyes. Children got sick. They recovered. But now Maya was outside with Britta, playing in the melting snow, and that wall of cloud was coming, and Karen was 100 yards away. She screamed their names. The wind took the sound. Britta looked up first. She saw her mother running and knew something was wrong. She grabbed Maya's hand and started toward the shelter. Karen reached them at the door flap, pushed them inside, pulled the flap closed behind her. The temperature had already dropped. She could feel it, the warmth of the morning bleeding away, replaced by something sharper. She lashed the door flap with hands that had started to shake. "Mama?" Britta's voice was small. "What's happening?" "A storm. A bad one." "How bad?" Karen looked at her daughter, 6 years old, already old enough to know that some questions didn't have answers she wanted to hear. "Stay by the fire. Keep Maya warm. Don't open the door for any reason." She went back outside. The cloud wall was closer now, close enough that she could see it wasn't really clouds at all. It was snow, driven horizontal by wind she couldn't yet feel, a white curtain erasing the world. She had perhaps 5 minutes before it reached her. The wood pile. She'd left wood outside, stacked against the bark wall because there hadn't been room inside. She needed it inside. All of it. Every piece she could carry. She made 4 trips. On the 3rd trip, the wind hit. Not a gust, but a wall of moving air that slammed into her like something solid. She staggered, caught herself, kept moving. On the 4th trip, the snow arrived. Fine ice crystals, not flakes, driving into her face like needles. She couldn't see the shelter. She couldn't see anything except white. She found the door flat by touch, pulled it open, fell inside, lashed it closed behind her. The roar of the wind filled the world. 1 o'clock. Temperature inside the shelter, approximately 60 degrees. The fire burned steady, fed by the wood she'd hauled in. Maya slept on a pile of blankets, her forehead warm but not burning. Britta sat beside her sister, watching the bark walls flex with each gust. "The walls are moving," Britta said. "They're supposed to move. It's how the structure works. The poles bend instead of breaking." "What if they break?" "They won't." Karen didn't know if that was true. She'd built this shelter based on observation and guesswork and the help of a woman she'd met twice. She'd never tested it against a storm like this. No one had ever tested it against a storm like this. The schoolhouse blizzard, people would later call it, and they would remember it for a century. The structure shuddered. The lashing at the apex creaked. Wind screamed through the smoke flaps, and Karen realized she needed to adjust them, or the fire would die. She untied the door flap. The cold hit her face like a fist. Minus something. She couldn't tell how far below 0, but far enough that exposed skin burned. She reached around the edge of the door, found the exterior poles that controlled the smoke flaps, and adjusted them by feel. Her fingers went numb before she finished. She pulled them back inside and held them near the fire until the feeling returned. Pins and needles, then pain, then warmth. The smoke rose cleanly now. The fire burned brighter. 2 o'clock. Temperature outside had dropped below 0. The bark walls groaned with each gust. Snow drove against the conical surface and slid down. She could hear it, a constant hiss like sand through an hourglass. The steep walls shed the weight before it could accumulate. That was the design. That was why the cone shape worked. But nothing had tested the design like this. 3 o'clock. The interior had cooled to 50 degrees. The cold was infiltrating faster than the fire could warm. Karen fed the fire larger pieces, watched the flames climb, calculated how long her wood supply would last. 5 days at normal burn rate, but this wasn't normal. She was burning half again as much as usual, and the storm showed no sign of stopping. 4 days, maybe less. Maya stirred. Her fever had climbed. Karen could feel it when she touched her daughter's forehead, hot skin in a room that was growing cold. The child needed to cool down, but the air needed to warm up. Opposite problems with no common solution. Karen wrapped Maya in damp cloths, wiped her face with cool water, hoped the fever would break on its own. Britta watched everything. "Is Maya going to die like Papa?" The question hit Karen like the wind had hit her outside. "No." "How do you know?" "Because I won't let her." 4 o'clock. Maya's fever spiked. She was hot to the touch everywhere. Forehead, cheeks, chest, hands. Her breathing was fast and shallow. She whimpered in her sleep, caught in dreams Karen couldn't see. The interior temperature had dropped to 48 degrees. Karen faced a choice with no right answer. Let the fire drop and cool Maya's fever, or keep the fire high and risk the fever climbing higher. She chose the middle, maintained the fire at a level that held the room at 50 degrees, cool enough to help but warm enough to survive. She soaked cloths in water that was already cold from the air. wrapped them around Maya's wrists, behind her neck, across her forehead. The water warmed against the child's skin and had to be replaced every few minutes. 5 o'clock. Full dark. The wind screamed without pause, a sound like the earth itself tearing open. The structure swayed and settled and swayed again. Each gust brought a new creak from the poles, a new groan from the lashing points. Karin watched the apex where all the poles came together and waited for something to give. Nothing gave. 6 o'clock. Temperature outside, approximately -11 and falling. Temperature inside, 48 degrees. The fire ate wood with an appetite Karin hadn't expected. She calculated again, 3.5 days of fuel remaining, maybe 3. The storm had been raging for 6 hours. It showed no sign of stopping. 7 o'clock. Karin thought about Halverson's cabin, 2 miles away. Heavy logs, proper chinking, a stone fireplace. But the cabin had a flat roof. Snow would be piling on it now, tons of snow, pressing down with weight the roof wasn't designed to bear. And the door, Halverson's door, faced east, which meant the leeward drift would be building against it. By morning, that drift could be 6 feet high. Higher. She thought about the sod dugouts scattered across the county. Flat roofs like Halverson's, but weaker. Some of them would collapse tonight. She was certain of it. She thought about the schoolhouses, those one-room buildings where children had walked this morning in light coats, thinking the warm spell would last. Some of those children were still in the schoolhouses now, their teachers trying to decide whether to keep them there or send them home. The ones who stayed might survive. The ones who left might not. She thought about the families she would never meet, huddled in cabins that were running out of fuel, watching their fires die, knowing what came next. 8 o'clock. Maya's fever held steady. High, but not climbing. The cloths helped. The cool air helped. Karin kept replacing the water, kept wiping down her daughter's skin, kept doing the only thing she could do. Britta had fallen asleep, curled against her mother's side. Even in sleep, her hand gripped Karin's dress. 9 o'clock. Temperature outside, -15. Temperature inside, 46 degrees. The fire was doing everything it could, but the cold was stronger. The bark walls leaked heat through 1,000 tiny gaps. The smoke flaps let cold air in even as they let smoke out. But the structure held. The poles bent with each gust but didn't break. The bark sheets flexed but didn't tear. The lashing points creaked but didn't fail. All those weeks of work, all those stitches, pull, tighten, all that pine pitch and bear grease and basswood cordage, all of it was being tested now, and so far, all of it was enough. 10 o'clock. Karin allowed herself to think they might survive. It was a dangerous thought. The storm wasn't over. The night was young. 100 things could still go wrong, but the structure was holding and the fire was burning, and her children were alive. She fed the fire and watched the smoke rise and waited for what came next. 11 o'clock. Maya woke crying, not the feverish whimper of earlier, something sharper, more present. Karin checked her forehead. Still warm, but less warm than before. The fever was weakening. Mama, I'm cold. I know, baby, I know. She wrapped Maya in dry blankets, pulled her close, let her body heat add to the fire's warmth. Britta woke and pressed against them both. The 3 of them huddled together while the wind raged outside. Midnight. Temperature outside, approximately -25. Temperature inside, 44 degrees, the worst hour. Karin calculated. At the current burn rate, she had 3 days of wood remaining. If the storm lasted longer than that, she would have to make decisions she didn't want to make. Burn the blankets first, then the furniture she'd brought from the wagon, then the wagon parts she'd stored inside for exactly this possibility. After that, after that, she would burn whatever kept her children alive, including pieces of the structure itself, if she had to. But she wasn't there yet. 3 days. The storm couldn't last 3 days. Could it? 1 o'clock in the morning, January 13th. The wind began to change, not stopping, not yet, but shifting direction, coming now from the north instead of the northwest. The sound changed too, from a scream to a moan. Lower, steadier, still deadly, but different. Karen checked the smoke flaps, adjusted them for the new wind direction. The fire flared brighter as the draft improved. 2 o'clock. Temperature outside, -30. Temperature inside, 45 degrees. A degree warmer than an hour ago. The wind was dying and the fire was winning. 3 o'clock. The wind dropped. Not to nothing. Gusts still buffeted the structure, but the constant roar faded to something intermittent. The silence between gusts was almost louder than the noise had been. Karin looked at the apex. The poles were still in place. The lashing points were still tight. The bark sheets were still sewn to the frame. The structure had held. 4 o'clock. Temperature outside, -35. The coldest hour of the night as the sky cleared and heat radiated into space. But inside the bark shelter, the temperature was rising, 46, 47, 48 degrees. The fire burned steadily. The wood supply was diminished, but not exhausted. The storm was over. 5 o'clock. Maya's fever broke. Karin felt it happen. The sudden change in her daughter's breathing, the cool sweat that broke out on her forehead, the relaxation of muscles that had been tight with sickness. Maya opened her eyes, looked at her mother, and asked for water. Karin gave it to her. Then she sat back and realized she was crying. Britt awoke and saw the tears. "Mama, are we going to die?" Karin wiped her face. "No, we're going to make breakfast." Dawn came gray and cold. Karin opened the door flap and looked out at a world transformed. Snow lay across the meadow in drifts that reached higher than her head in some places, sculpted by wind into shapes that looked almost deliberate. The temperature was still 35 below zero. The air hurt to breathe. But the sky was clear. The wind was gone, and the bark shelter stood undamaged against the morning light. She walked around the structure, checked every seam, every lashing point, every place where bark met bark. She found nothing wrong. The snow that had accumulated against the leeward side was perhaps 2 feet deep. The steep walls had shed the rest, exactly as they were supposed to. The door opened outward. She had cleared it easily this morning. There was no 6-foot drift blocking her exit, no wall of snow she had to dig through. She thought about Halverson 2 miles away. She wondered if his cabin was still standing. Halverson arrived on January 14th. Karin saw him coming across the meadow, a dark figure moving slowly through drifts that reached his thighs. He walked like a man who had been tested and was not sure he had passed. She was outside the shelter, helping the girls build a figure from snow, the ordinary work of children on a winter day, made extraordinary by the fact that they were alive to do it. Halverson stopped a few yards away. He looked at the shelter. He looked at the girls. He looked at the smoke rising clean from the apex. "Your roof?" Karen asked. "Nearly came down. Beams dropped 3 inches under the snow. Spent 2 days digging out. The drift against the door was higher than I'm tall." He paused. "Burned my chairs. Most of my bedding. My woodpile was buried. I couldn't reach it until this morning. The pig? Dead. Froze in the pen before I could get to it." He walked around the shelter the way he had walked around it in November, but his eyes read something different now. Then he had been looking for weaknesses. Now he was looking for the reason he had been wrong. Karin invited him inside. He ducked through the door flap and stood in the center of the space, where the fire burned small and steady. The interior temperature was perhaps 55 degrees. The girls came in behind him and went back to the porridge they had been eating before his arrival. Halverson stood there for a long time. "I buried the Hanson boy in '63, he finally said, "froze in a sod house that collapsed. I told his mother she should have built stronger. I've been telling people how to survive out here for 11 years. He looked at the bark walls, at the liner that held the warmth close, at the smoke flaps, angled perfectly for the morning's light wind. I never told them to build like the Indians. Maybe I should have." Karin poured him coffee from the pot by the fire. He wrapped his 8-fingered hands around the cup and drank. "How much wood did you burn through the storm?" "About a quarter cord." "A quarter cord." He shook his head. "I burned 2. More than 2. The structure is smaller, less air to heat." "I know." He drank more coffee. "You'll still have skeptics, the land office, the church folk, the people who need to believe there's only one right way to do things. But I'll tell anyone who asks. The bark tent held. The log cabin nearly didn't." He finished the coffee, handed her the cup, and ducked back outside. "Mrs. Lindqvist." She followed him out. "I was wrong. I don't say that often, but I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about this." He gestured at the shelter. "When you're ready to prove up, I'll vouch for you at the land office. Tell them the structure is habitable. Tell them it's more habitable than half the cabins in this county." He walked away without waiting for a response. He didn't need one. He'd given his verdict, and this time the verdict was different. The visitors came in waves. First the Olsons, a family from 4 miles south who had lost half their firewood supply to the drift that buried it. They wanted to understand the fuel efficiency. Karin showed them the fire, explained the liner system, drew diagrams in the snow. Then Agnes Dahl, who arrived with a jar of preserves and a face that said she'd come to apologize. "I told you the bark would crack. I told you the seams would split." She looked at the walls, the joints, the pitch ceiling that had held against everything the storm could throw at it. "I was wrong. You were cautious. It's not the same thing." It felt the same. Agnes walked the interior, asking questions. How thick was the dead air gap? How did the smoke flaps work? What was the pitch made of? She wrote nothing down, but Karin could see her memorizing every detail. "If I built something like this attached to my cabin," Agnes said, "a smaller space just for winter sleeping and sitting, would you help me design it?" "Yes." "Why? After what I said?" Karin thought about it. "Because you came back. Because you admitted you were wrong. And because if this works for more people survive." Agnes nodded slowly. "You're not what I expected." Neither was this winter. They planned the hybrid structure over the following weeks. A bark-covered conical extension attached to Agnes's existing cabin, combining the storage and summer living space of the cabin with the fuel efficiency of the cone. It wasn't what Karin had built. It was something new, something adapted to Agnes's needs. By late February, the frame was up. By March, it was covered. By spring, 4 families in Aitkin County had incorporated elements of the bark shelter design into their homesteads. 2 built full conical structures for winter use. 1 built Agnes's hybrid. 1 simply added an interior liner to an existing cabin and saw their fuel consumption drop by half. Karin shared her knowledge without charge. She drew diagrams for anyone who asked. She showed people the correct angles for smoke flaps, the way to seal seams with pitch, the importance of the dead air gap. She acknowledged every time that she had learned from Ojibwe builders who had known these techniques for centuries. She didn't invent anything, she adapted, and she passed on what she had learned because survival shouldn't be a secret. Lars Bergstrom filed his protest with the land office in April. The register summoned Karen to Aitken, where she stood in a small office while Bergstrom argued that a bark tepee did not constitute a dwelling under the Homestead Act. The structure was temporary, he said. It was Indian housing, not suitable for civilized habitation. The law required permanent improvements, and this widow had made none. Karen listened without interrupting. When Bergstrom finished, the register asked if she had witnesses. She did. Gunnar Halvorsen testified that the bark shelter was more habitable than many cabins he had seen in his 11 years in the county. He described the temperature inside during the blizzard. He described his own cabin's failures, the sagging roof, the blocked door, the furniture he had burned. Agnes Dahl testified that she had been inside the structure multiple times and found it warm, dry, and well constructed. She described the hybrid design she had built based on Karin's methods. She noted that the land office's own records showed 4 successful proving up applications in the past year that listed bark-covered frame dwelling as the improvement type. The register considered the testimony. He reviewed the Homestead Act's language, which required a dwelling, but did not specify logs or sod or any particular material. He considered the purpose of the law to encourage settlement and cultivation of the land, and whether that purpose was served by a woman who had survived a killing winter and was now preparing to plant crops in the spring. He ruled in Karin's favor. The bark shelter was a dwelling. The claim could proceed. Bergstrom left without speaking to anyone. He sold his 320 acres the following year and moved to St. Paul. He never acknowledged that he had been wrong. Some people couldn't. By the winter of 1888 to 89, 7 homesteads in Aitken and neighboring Crow Ween counties used bark shelter designs or incorporated bark shelter principles into their construction. The specific techniques: conical frame, layered bark covering, interior liner, adjustable smoke flaps, spread through observation and word of mouth. No one patented anything. No one sold instructions. The knowledge belonged to anyone who needed it. The land office recorded 4 successful proving up applications that year, listing bark-covered frame dwelling as the improvement type. Language that would have been unthinkable before the blizzard had become ordinary. The frontier was adapting, the way frontiers always did, incorporating what worked and forgetting what didn't. Karen Lindqvist proved up her claim in 1892, 160 acres owned outright, hers to keep or sell as she chose. She chose to keep it. She never remarried. She added a frame house in 1895, built with lumber she paid for in cash from years of selling butter, eggs, and seamstress work. The bark shelter remained standing until 1901, used as a storage building and, during particularly bitter cold snaps, as a warm room for the family. Britta married a schoolteacher in 1904. Maya contracted influenza during the pandemic of 1918 and survived. She credited her mother's insistence on proper ventilation, a lesson learned perhaps in a bark shelter where smoke rose clean and air circulated the way air was supposed to circulate. Karin died in 1923, age 68, on the land she had refused to sell. She is buried in the Aitken Lutheran Cemetery, 2 rows from Gunnar Halvorsen, who outlived her by 4 years. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 55 degrees in 7 hours. Children froze in schoolhouses across the northern plains. Teachers who tried to lead them home died within sight of shelter they could not reach. Families perished in cabins whose roofs collapsed under the weight of snow and whose doors were blocked by drifts higher than a man could stand. 235 people died, and the count was probably low, The frontier didn't keep careful records of those who disappeared. Gunnar Halvorsen, who had survived 11 Minnesota winters, who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite and buried 3 people in the cold, had told Karin plainly, "You'll watch those girls turn blue, and there won't be a thing you can do but hold them while they die." But on the morning of January 13th, 1888, Karin Lindqvist made breakfast over a small fire in a bark tent that had cost nothing to build. Her daughters ate porridge in a room that held 55 degrees while the world outside was 40 below zero. The conical walls that everyone said would collapse had shed the snow. The bark seams that everyone said would crack had held through 18 hours of wind and cold that killed people in log cabins and sod houses across 4 states. The skeptics had measured her by what they knew. They knew cabins. They knew sod. They knew the conventional wisdom of a frontier that killed people who didn't follow the rules. They didn't know what she could learn. They didn't know what she could build. Karin never argued with them. She didn't have to. The structure was the argument, standing in the morning light while the snow slid down its bark walls and piled soft at the base. Inside, the children were warm.